Welcome to the Simply Biblical Podcast. My name is Nick Sloan, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jonathan McAtee. How are you doing today, John?
I am doing great. It's been a pretty good day, very productive, gotten a lot of stuff done, and I'm excited to get into our last episode on the Passover. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. I had a nice Christmas and New Year's. I'm getting over a little sickness right now, so if I sound a little weird, my apologies on that. But yeah, I'm excited to wrap this series up too. It's been a fun one, but it's been a long one too. So ready to tackle the next subject.
Yeah, I can't wait to get into what we have next. But today we are finishing our series, like we said, and we're going to dive into the Lord's Supper and how we should understand communion in light of the Passover. And it's important to point out that Jesus specifically chose the Passover celebration to be the one where he was crucified during. It wasn't just at some random point in time. It wasn't some random point in the year, but he chose the week of Passover to be the background and the context in which he would be betrayed, crucified, and lifted up. His hour had come, so we need to understand why he chose this time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's, when you just read a story at face value, you don't really pick up on kind of certain cues like that where, like, why did Jesus choose this time? Or, like, why did it happen this way,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's a good question. Questions like that are always good to be asking yourself as you're reading. Like John and I have been trying to, get this idea into you, like everything happens. There's no coincidences when it comes to like the times of an event or a recurring theme, a recurring word. Like they're very intentional, and so yeah, there's a reason why he chose this, and hopefully we can answer that for you guys.
Yeah. So just to recap what Passover meant at the time of Jesus, the original meaning, of course, it was a celebration of Yahweh's protection and covering on the night of the 10th plague and the substitution of the firstborn for the lamb. And so that's what it was. Of course, the first night of the Passover, or as we call it sometimes, the cover over, where the lamb took the place of the firstborn and Yahweh's protection was over the house. And then later in Israel's history, the Passover became a time to remember the covenant between Israel and Yahweh, and it was a moment of renewed faithfulness. And we talked about this 2 episodes ago of what happened later on in Passover's history and how the meaning changed a little bit. But ultimately it was a similar idea. And then also, Passover at the time of Jesus brought a lot of eschatological hope, which eschatology means the end times or things that are going to happen at the end. And there was just a ton of eschatological hope when it came to Passover time, that God will send the Messiah and rescue his people and bring in the Messianic age. And this is seen in Ezekiel and then carried into the New Testament as well, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. And then last week, we talked about Jesus being the Passover lamb, which we talked through John in that episode. But this week, we are looking at the Lord's Supper in light of the Passover. So, Nick, would you like to move us forward?
Yes. So what did the Passover meal look like and symbolize? The Israelites would have sacrificed the Passover lamb earlier in the day and brought it to the house where they were going to have the meal. And again, this lamb represented that Passover event where the angel of death passed over all the houses and the Israelite firstborn sons were spared. And then so they would gather in the evening on the first day of Passover. And so if you didn't know already, Passover isn't just a one-day event. It's a week-long celebration where they would just have different things, different feasts and traditions that they would do each day to celebrate the Passover event. And so at their meals, there were They would have 4 cups of wine, bitter herbs, and bread eaten, all symbolic with meaning, which we've talked about a couple episodes ago, so we're not going to get super deep into the different meanings of each dish. But this time we're going to talk more so about how Jesus applied them to himself. And another part of the mealtime was singings. The Jews during this time would sing different psalms from 113 through 118 and split it into 2 sections. And so we'll talk about what that meant as we get to it. But before the Last Supper meal, where Jesus had celebrated this with his disciples, Jesus would have said a blessing, which would have started with this: "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine." With how Jesus connects the fruit of the vine to his own blood, this statement is so important. And then they would drink the first cup of wine together. John, you want to talk about why the statement is important?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at it, like Jesus himself would have said, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine." And the fact that he himself would be talking about his blood as the fruit of the vine in the third cup of wine that they drink, it's just at least to me, it brings up a lot of thoughts of, well, like this was truly God sent his son for this purpose. So God, he is Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. He was the one who set this plan into motion, that Jesus would be the one who shed his blood for all of the earth to forgive the sins of everyone, and so that way we could be covered by his blood and his life through his death. And I don't know, I just think that's a pretty powerful way to start off the meal, knowing how it's going to end. But that's what I got for you.
That's good. Thank you, John. And so after that first cup of wine, the common next step is to do a ritual hand washing. And then after the hand washing is the bitter herbs. And this was done in remembrance of slavery in Egypt, bringing back to their memory the thing that God delivered them from. Again, they didn't just celebrate what was, they ate bitter herbs so that they could partake in the suffering that their ancestors lived through. So it's a cool and unique thing that they did in eating the bitter herbs. And then going along with that, the next part of the dinner was the second cup of wine and a retelling of the Exodus story, beginning with the 400 years of slavery to God raising up Moses, the 10 plagues, the night of the 10th plague, where God delivered the firstborn and covered the houses of Israel, all the way to their departure out of Egypt. And then after this, it's commonly understood that they would have sung the first part of the Psalms that they were singing, that is Psalms 113 through 118. So they would typically read 113 and 114. Scripture doesn't mention the first part of the songs. Psalm 113 was all about giving praise to God, who is above all, just honoring him, glorifying him. And then Psalm 114 was about the Exodus story, and so it was retelling their story, and it was just a song that they would sing to remember where they came from and their whole Exodus story. So, John, do you want to read us Psalm 114?
Yeah, sure. It's a short psalm. It says, "When Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of a strange language, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled, Jordan turned back, the mountains stripped like rams, and the hills like lambs. What ails you, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? O mountains, that you skip like rams? O hills, like lambs? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water." So it mentions parting of the Red Sea. It mentions the stopping of the Jordan River, and even God providing water from a rock in the wilderness. Having this background of the connections of the Exodus story and Passover makes Jesus turning these symbols point towards him even more shocking and even more insightful, because we can see how it went from the original story of the Exodus and then retelling in the Psalms, in literally songs, and then how they would sing that during Jesus's time and during the Last Supper, and then how those relate to Jesus's turning these ideas and these symbols towards himself. And I think that's where we get a lot of meaning, and more than just a plain reading, we can dive a little bit deeper into what it's actually saying. And so that's, if you don't mind me jumping in, that's where we get to next. The actual meal begins with the breaking of bread. This was the unleavened bread that Jesus blesses and breaks. And there are two parts to the unleavened bread. First, it was practical. They didn't put leaven in the bread because they didn't have time to wait for it to rise while they were escaping Egypt. So it became a symbol of their quick deliverance out of slavery. And then the second is theological. Leaven often symbolized sin or evil because fermentation implied decay or corruption. So having unleavened bread was a way of saying that the Israelites are consecrating themselves at Passover. Consecrating means to make holy. So they're consecrating themselves at Passover. This Passover interpretation of the bread lines up with how Jesus pointed towards himself. Jesus' mission parallels the bread. He was unleavened by being completely sinless. Jesus went through all of life without sinning. His will was always aligned with the Father's, and so he never missed the mark like the rest of humanity does. His sinlessness was for a purpose, and we can see that right here. He was able to take on the role of the unleavened bread and be broken for humanity's redemption, as well as being the spotless Passover lamb like we talked about last week. And I love how all of these symbols, all of these ideas from the Old Testament, like we talked about, I think last week and probably the week before, they get fulfilled in Jesus. So Jesus can be a lamb. At the same time, he can also be some bread. And it sounds funny if you say it, and someone who doesn't know what you're talking about would be confused. But when you understand the symbolic nature of them and what they mean, then it becomes really important and really huge when we're trying to understand Jesus and what he did. And rather than the unleavened bread just being a symbol of redemption out of Egypt and dedication to God, Jesus' body, the true unleavened bread, is actually able to redeem us out of our own Egypt and our slavery and sin and death. So later in the New Testament, Paul talks about the slavery in Romans 6, Galatians 4 and 5, and Titus 3. Jesus came to set us free from the slavery. Unleavened bread was a reminder of what happened in the past, but Jesus' body as unleavened bread isn't just a reminder, but it's the reality that we can become free like the Israelites were free. So our slavery is not to a physical empire like back then, but it's to sin and death. And Jesus came to set us free from that slavery and to unleaven us by getting rid of the sin that is within us. Like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, he says, "Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." Jesus is not just reminding us of something from the past, but he's pointing forwards to something that is happening here and now, that we can be freed from sin and death through his body. So when we take the bread of communion, just picture yourself at church. You're taking communion however your church does it. You're remembering Christ's death, and that is central. But doing that through the lens of the Passover is so helpful to know exactly what we should be thinking about. Jesus is the sinless, unleavened bread that is able to rescue us out of slavery to sin and death. This allows us to be thankful, not just that Jesus died, but actually why he died and how it personally impacts every believer. And that's just the first example of how Jesus points these symbols that have rich meaning towards himself, and it just adds layers and layers of meaning for us. And as we continue to talk about this, I think it'll bring out more for us. And I just love how it is so practical for us, because we're able to take this next time we do communion in church, which for me, I believe will be next Sunday. I'll be able to actually think about Jesus is the unleavened bread and what that means. What do you think about that, Nick?
It's so cool just seeing all the different parallels that there are between even just, the Jewish culture and how Jesus will just work through it. The unleavened bread is, until we started talking about it, wasn't anything that I really had taken notice of, and it's a really neat, really cool connection to think of, especially like how you're saying the practicality of it. Just thinking of how when we're taking communion ourselves, like you think like when you're taking the bread, you already have in your mind that this is Christ's body that he sacrificed, but to put it in perspective, where it was a tradition that they had been doing to celebrate Passover, and then looking at all the connections that we've been pointing out this whole series of Passover, and how it was an event that happened in time, but it also foreshadowed so much, just so much that you can look at and be thankful for, when really all, like, Christ's sacrifice is enough to be thankful for all of eternity. But then the layers and layers of things that you can look at and just be like, wow, like, this wasn't even just, like, it's not like some small thing. I don't even, like, there's so much to look at, so much to think about, so much to be grateful for. Yeah.
Scripture it's kind of like an onion, or
like an
ogre, if you like Shrek. Yes, exactly. But for real though, because like even from like one layer, it's great.
Mm-hmm.
And it's life-changing. It's amazing. But then you can start peeling back layers, and there's more depth to it, and it's pretty awesome. As as far as you go, it just gets greater and greater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you start realizing how many more connections there are, because, I mean, once you peel back once you find one connection, it's so much easier to see the next one and the next one.
That's so true. Even as I was preparing for this and coming up with some content, I forget where it was exactly, but I was reading, I think it was in the Psalms that we've been talking about, and how they would sing these Psalms, and I was seeing the connection from those Psalms to what we're talking about with Passover. But then I was also seeing things that connect all the way back to Genesis, and talking about blessing, talking about, all kinds of things. And I was like, whoa, there's so many connections. I had to keep my mind on track, so that way I wasn't just going overboard. But it really is, once you peel back one layer, you see some more, and then it's just everywhere, and it's pretty cool to dive into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you texted me earlier this week, I think it was, and you were saying how you found another connection. I was like, man, you just keep stumbling upon these, and you responded, yeah, dude, they're everywhere.
They are. Yeah.
Yeah, the more that you dive into it, the more that you just find them and see them. But yeah, back to it. The unleavened bread, what it represented is important. And then knowing how how he connected himself, his body, to that is an important thing to keep in mind, especially when it comes to taking communion and just knowing the history of God's people. But after the breaking of bread, this is typically when they would eat the lamb and share a meal together. So this reminded and symbolized God's rescue of the firstborn, his protective covering over the houses of the Israelites. And then after the meal, they would drink the third cup of wine, called the cup of redemption. The 4 cups are supposed to represent the 4 parts of Exodus 6:6-7. And I'm going to read it to you. It says, "Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people." And so each cup of wine that they were to drink represented one of these promises. They did it to remember and honor God for each of these promises. The first one was, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Second, and I will deliver you from slavery to them. Third, and I'll redeem you with an outstretched arm with great acts of judgment. And then finally, the fourth, I will take you to be my people. And verse 7 goes on to say, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And so this third cup that they would drink after the meal is all about God redeeming his people with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. And this is the one that Jesus uses to inaugurate the new covenant. And the crazy thing is, the judgment is not against us or the Egyptians. With this new covenant, the judgment is placed on Jesus, God incarnate. And it is through his death, his sacrifice, that we have the ultimate redemption. Jesus says, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. He's taking the disciples' understanding of this third cup, which was about redemption out of slavery, and pointing it toward his own life that would be given up so that we could have ultimate redemption out of sin. So to understand the cup through the lens of the Passover means that we don't just see the cup as representing Jesus' blood and his death. We also see the purpose behind the cup, which was redemption, redeeming our lives up from the pit, restoring us to relationship with God through this new covenant. And so obviously, just like we've been talking about, you can peel back so many layers. So there's plenty more that we can get into when it comes to the meaning of this cup, of the other cups. But when it comes to the Lord's Supper, in light of the Passover, we're going to just stick to this, where it was all about Jesus redeeming us, redeeming his people from sin.
Yeah, there's so much that you could talk about with covenants and marriage covenants, Old Testament covenants, all kinds of stuff that you could get into. And but yeah, like you said, we're going to keep it at that, so that way we just focus on what we're focusing on. But it's also important to note, in the traditional Passover meal, there are 4 cups of wine that go with the meal, but Jesus stops after the third. And this has huge implications, which I didn't even know about until this past week. He says that he will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So he's saying he won't drink the 4th cup until he comes back. And understanding what the 4th cup means, it makes so much sense. The 4th cup represents the 4th part of Exodus 6:6-7, which says, I will take you to be my people and I will be your God. This is heavily eschatological. So he leaves this cup and does not drink it until its meaning is actually fulfilled. This is the cup that we will drink together at the coming of his kingdom. And when I read this and realized that he didn't actually finish the Passover meal, but left it after the 3rd cup, I was like, this is huge. This makes so much sense. Why he says that he won't drink of the cup until the kingdom has come, because it is talking about when he will come back and take us to be his people, and he will be our God. It's exactly what Exodus 6:7 is saying, and I think that's very important for us to understand. Isn't that pretty mind-blowing, Nick?
Yeah, it is, man. It's crazy how much just how much understanding the culture and tradition affects our understanding of the Bible. It sounds kind of like obvious, but also something that's just so overlooked. I mean, how many times have we heard the story of the Last Supper, where Jesus is with his disciples, and a lot of this stuff just gets looked over. A lot of the true meaning behind. I mean, we get the new covenant, we get Jesus' sacrifice, but we don't get all that background information as well. That just adds so much more light to that whole the whole process of those 10 plagues. It adds so much meaning to even just that story, reading it, and then understanding how the Israelites, they would celebrate that. Adds, it can change a whole it can change a whole topic from being just like kind of boring historical and add so much more life into it, so much more beauty, so much more purpose behind it. And then when it comes to this fourth cup, knowing that, because I mean, without knowing that the four cups represent something, it could just be like, well, all right, why is he not taking the fourth cup? But knowing that, man, this is the promise that he's going to take us as his people when the time's right, just adds a lot of theological depth to it, a lot more purpose than just him leaving a cup until he comes back. Like.
I agree. And so, to wrap up our Passover series, let's just take a look at what is Passover's ongoing value for the church. So just kind of wrapping up what we've talked about through the series. We set the stage for the Passover, talking about its context leading up to it, talked about the plagues, talked about the night of the Passover and what took place, talked about the misunderstanding of Passover or cover over, protection over. That was a good episode. If you haven't checked that out, go back and listen to that. We talked about Passover moving forward and how it develops throughout the Old Testament and how it becomes eschatological, thinking about the Messiah is going to come and he's going to set up his reign and things like that. And then talking about Jesus as the Passover lamb in John. And then now the Lord's Supper in light of the Passover. We've covered a lot of ground, and hopefully we've added some life to the text and some understanding to our listeners. So just wrapping things up, I think that the Passover has major ongoing value for the church, first because it adds so much meaning and depth to Jesus's identity. Seeing him from different angles and knowing him fully in what the text is trying to tell us, and even how he's the Passover lamb, and going through John and learning about that last week was huge. And I think that can help us understand who Jesus is. And as followers of Jesus and followers of Christ, and we call ourselves Christians, we should know about our Christ, about our Messiah, about Jesus. And so I want to understand him from every angle that Scripture gives us. And so I think this was a huge step for that, and understanding Passover, what it used to mean in the Old Testament, and how Jesus shaped that and changed that and fulfilled it. I think that's huge. Do you want to go on to the next one?
Yeah, it adds depth and meaning to communion and what Jesus did on the cross, knowing that, again, just kind of what we've been going over through this whole episode, just the different nuances that come with the different promises and how each wine represented that. The sacrifice, the lamb sacrifice, and how Jesus, like you were saying, he's our Passover lamb. He's our perfect, spotless lamb that was sacrificed for us. What that lamb represented to the people at that time, what Jesus, as our lamb, represents to us in this time. The unleavened bread, what the unleavened bread represented, and how Jesus' body fulfills that and represents that to us today. All the meaning behind different traditions that the Passover holds adds so much value, to what Jesus did, what it all means for us today in the new covenant.
Yeah. And then number 3, I think that it helps the Passover's ongoing value. It helps Christians see the history of our faith and how the Bible is one unified story. Shout out Bible Project. But it is important to see that the Old Testament is not to be forgotten or to not be read, but it adds so much when you're reading the New Testament, and when you're trying to understand things in the New Testament, you need to know your Old Testament. You need to know what happens in the history of the people of God, because that's important. And if you want to interpret the New Testament rightly, you better know your Old Testament. So even just having a grasp on what the Passover is can help a lot when we're talking about knowing the history of the people of God. And if we call ourselves people of God, we should know it. And so that's why we do things like this podcast, to help us and our listeners know who God is, know what kind of faith we belong to, and to know Christ more. Anything else to add, Nick?
No, I think you hit the nail with that. Just knowing the history of God's people is knowing also the history of God, knowing Him better and more deeply. That helps even just your own relationship with God. I mean, there's so many different names, so many different words that people have used to describe God, used to describe Jesus, and knowing where that came from just brings you closer to Him. You just learn more about His story, learn more about the works that He's done. It'll draw you closer to Him, draw you deeper in love with Him, deeper in love with Scripture. And so, yeah, it's important not to just, like you were saying, I know a lot of Christians, they'll just read the New Testament because the Old Testament's boring, or we live under a new covenant, so the Old Testament isn't as important for us to read. But I mean, hopefully with series like this, we help kind of shift if any of you guys have that mindset, or even if you just think that the New Testament is just more important, and that the Old Testament doesn't have as much value. Hopefully a series and episodes like this just kind of shift that perspective into thinking that, man, they build off of one another. Like, yeah, the Old Testament, Jesus fulfilled what was written in the past, but it doesn't mean that what was written in the past needs to be left there. It still adds value. It still adds theological depth to what we're reading in the New Testament. But yeah, it's important. Yeah, it's important to read them hand in hand, to know where the New Testament builds off of certain writings, certain books in the Old Testament, and how fulfilling what was written in the past. You can't just read one without the other. The New Testament is so hinged on what was written in the Old Testament, and it just builds off of too much to not know what's going on. Yeah, it just adds way too much depth, way too much value to just ignore it, to just ignore the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think that wraps up our Passover series. So it's been a good one. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it, learned some stuff, listened along the way. If you've learned some things, share it with your friends so that way they can learn as well. Thank you for tuning in and listening. And yeah, thank you for listening to the Simply Biblical podcast, where our goal is that all people would know Christ through the study of His Word. We'll see you next episode.